This is In the Trenches, broadcast 3.
Welcome to In the Trenches, where entrepreneurs, artists, writers, designers, inventors, warriors, and leaders share their stories of doing the hard, creative work that impacts all of our lives. Let the journey inspire you to do something worthwhile, build something bold, and create your life's work. And now, your host, Tom Morkis.
Welcome, everyone, to another broadcast of In the Trenches. Today's broadcast, I sit down with Al Pittampalli, the founder of the Modern Meeting Company and the author of Read This Before Our Next Meeting. I actually sat down with Al back in December of 2012 and recorded this conversation, but that was before I had started this podcast. So if you're a reader of my blog at www.tommorkis.com, you may have already listened to this conversation that we had. But for all the new listeners to this podcast, I decided the content is really just too good to pass up. So I remastered it as best as possible and put it into this episode. So again, I apologize that the quality isn't quite as good as the last episode. I didn't have all the equipment that I do now when I first recorded this. However, the content is killer, and you'll be happy if you do stick around and listen to the whole thing. And without further ado, here's today's broadcast. Hey everybody, this is Tom Morkis here, and with us today is Al Pittampalli. And Al is the founder of the Modern Meeting Company and a self-proclaimed meeting culture warrior. And he's on a mission to change the way organizations hold meetings, make decisions, and coordinate action. He is a published author. His book, Read This Before Our Next Meeting, was published by Seth Godin's Domino Project, and during the week of its release was the most popular Kindle book in the world. You could definitely learn a lot from this guy. Al has been featured in Forbes, The Telegraph, Huffington Post, CBS Money Watch, and many other publications. You can read his blog and find out more about him and his company at his website, modernmeetingstandard.com. Al is a sought-after speaker and writer and an all-around awesome guy. So Al, thank you very much for being here.
Hi Tom, great to be here.
Awesome. So Al, I'd like to start out by getting to know a little bit more about your background and how you became a meeting culture warrior.
Well, I guess the natural place to start was with my first, where I started career-wise, which is Ernst Young. Ernst Young is one of the big four accounting firms. I was what you call an IT auditor, which is as interesting as it sounds. Don't want to bore you with the details of it, but what we did do is I was a client service guy. So, every day I'd go to different Fortune 500 organizations all across the country, and I would talk to them. I would talk to them about what they're doing, the processes, and that type of thing. And the one thing I noticed was that there was just a whole lot of meetings going on. I mean, every single one of these organizations seemed to be meeting and meeting and meeting, and it concerned me because not a lot seemed to be happening inside of these meetings. So, I became obsessed with this question, which is why do all of these organizations, and it seemed like all of them, have these terrible meetings. Nobody seems to be getting anything done inside of them, yet everybody keeps doing it. So that became the driving force behind this obsession that I had, and to try to find a solution for it.
That's awesome. Okay, so what you did was you identified where there was something that was broken, and you basically went about fixing it as best you could.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, Tom, because, the expression I always use, which is not mine, but it's fish don't know they're in water, and there's so many things that are broken in the world, but a lot of times we don't see them as broken because we're just so used to them. They just show up to us as the way things are, and I think that some of the people that I really admire, the great thought leaders and authors, just were unwilling to kind of see something as the status quo and said, no, that's actually broken, and I think we should do something about it.
Yeah, exactly. So my question in that regard then is, what made you want to start your own company to fix that problem as opposed to, say, trying to fix it from inside another corporation or another company?
That's a really good question. I mean, I didn't want to be consumed by the same matrix that I was trying to solve.
Right.
I mean, it turns out trying to do it on the inside out is just kind of a tough thing because in order to solve the meeting problem, you got to have a lot of meetings in order to try to solve it, so it's almost counterproductive. So I did realize that as an outsider, I might have more pull. And one of the other things I realized is that, there's this interesting dynamic that happens within organizations, which is that it's kind of like, your family. If your brother, your sister, or somebody in your family tries to give you advice, they kind of say like, get out of here. I mean, what are you doing?
Right.
But if somebody from the outside tells you advice, and they have, they have a book, and they're on the stage, they're like, oh wow, that guy knows what he's talking about. And so I think that there's some real advantages to kind of being an outsider sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, that kind of ties pretty well into this next question. You mentioned, if you have a book and being an outsider with being a published author, it makes you pretty well respected and then somebody that people respond to. I guess let's dig into that a little bit. You did get published by the Domino Project, and I'd like to hear that story a little bit more. Take it from wherever you want, and let's go with that.
Sure. I mean, the way I met Seth Godin, who is obviously the leader of the Domino Project, the one who founded it, as I'm sure your listeners or readers probably are aware, I met him because I did his 6-month MBA program, and basically one day on his blog, I was a big fan of his, he wrote this post saying, don't go to business school. I thought that was really interesting, so I read ahead, and he said, consider coming to my office instead, because he wanted to do this thing called the alternative MBA, he would call it. And for 6 months, he would basically teach these, the people that got into the program everything he knows about business, which if anybody knows who Seth Godin is, which I know you do, Tom, obviously, you're a big fan, it's kind of like, getting invited to sit with Steve Jobs every single day for 6 months. I mean, it's not something that, you really want to pass up. So I applied, and I was lucky enough to get in. And so for 6 months, I really learned from this guy. I learned about business. I learned about life. I learned about, how to shift, how to get over your fear and how to do things. And throughout that process, something that I've always been interested in, but I never thought was possible, was writing a book. And Seth obviously has written something like 15 or 16 books at this point. Right. And, I was like, well, wait a minute, that's a really interesting business, because books are a business and they're a great marketing tool for your ideas. So, I started writing, I started getting pretty good at it. And, a couple years after, when I found out Seth was starting the Domino Project, I had developed the skills. I had this idea for a book about meetings, and I pitched him. And, I was lucky enough that he said yeah. That's incredible. I love that story. So you went about creating Modern Meeting Company first, your organization, and then you wrote the book simultaneously as you were creating your company. Is that correct? Yeah, I mean, the way it worked was, I was trying to, like I was telling you before, I was trying to get the attention of people inside of organizations and saying, hey, I have these ideas on how you can hold better meetings, how you can change the culture of your organization. And it was hard. I mean, it was very difficult to kind of get attention to people because I didn't have a lot of credibility at first, but I did get the chance to work with some small organizations, and I was really lucky to have gotten that experience. And I was really able to cultivate and test some ideas, and it worked. But I realized pretty early on that there's got to be something to propel this, and that's when I found out how valuable a book is. I mean, the great thing about a book is it spreads an idea almost better than anything I could think of. I mean, there's nothing more powerful. Every single one of your readers, listeners right now, and you yourself, Tom, has picked up a book, has read it, and it's blown their mind, and it's changed everything for them in that moment. And that's the power of a book. And so I decided to write one, and I'm lucky enough to work with people like Seth, who knew how to get it to spread, and it did. And so with the book and the spreading of it, I was able to, have opportunities to work with lots of bigger Fortune 500 organizations, and that was kind of the sequence of events. That's incredible. I totally agree with you, Al, on the topic of book being the best conduit for spreading an idea, if you will. And I think what's fascinating too is how you mentioned, that kind of gave you the credibility to reach more people and create a broader audience and really interact with more companies. And can you touch on that a little bit? Was that kind of a tipping point in your business at all? Did you notice that once you were published that it really changed things? Yeah, it really did. I mean, I don't think it was the publishing that did it. I think people kind of have this idea in their head that as soon as, and Seth will use that language, which is as soon as I get picked by someone, like as soon as Penguin, decides that this is my book, they will, I'll be famous, or I will have the credibility I need. And I don't think it's what it was. I mean, what it was the spreading of the idea that gave me credibility, right? It didn't matter that it was published in so much that, because Seth is not this, Domino Project was him and 7 other people, and sometimes it was just kind of him and someone else, depending on the stage that it was in.
Right.
And he didn't do anything really, except print the book, which he didn't do himself. I mean, he just got somebody else to print it.
Right.
And nobody knew, and not very many people knew what the Domino Project is unless you knew Seth, right? What the value of what Seth did was he had this vehicle, he had this great asset, he had this tribe that he was able to share this book with. And what really gave me the credibility is when multiple people in an organization read my book and they turned to each other and they started talking about it and they realized, wow, you read that book too? Wow, that guy must kind of know what he's talking about. And that, I think, is the goal of anybody who wants to be an authority or have some credibility in any field, is to get a small group of people who know about your work to start talking to each other about it, because that's what gives you the credibility, not the stature of being published.
So when it came to actually writing, and then also in terms of starting your own business, would you say that there were some fears or obstacles that you had to overcome, and how did you do that?
Oh, it was incredibly scary. I mean, I'll take the first one, which was writing the book. I mean, I am not traditionally a writer. I mean, I was lucky enough to have started blogging a while back, and best move I've ever made, because I hadn't written my entire life, but I started blogging every single day. And that really started to cultivate my writing skills, thank God, because by the time I wanted to write a book, at least, I had some foundation there. But, I can't tell you how much of a struggle it was to write a book, because I had never written something longer than, a couple blog posts, sans some papers in high school and that type of thing.
Right.
But anyway, with the first draft I wrote, Seth, it's still traumatic. I mean, the email that I got back in return was terrible. I mean, I wanted to cry. I think I did cry a couple times. And 2, 3 drafts. I mean, this guy is very nice, but he means business. I mean, if he doesn't like something, he knows. I mean, he'll tell you. And right around the third draft or so, it was a very frustrating process, because you start to question whether this is something you can do or not.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you how I overcame it was, which is I think it's kind of a funny story, is I was watching, Jerry Maguire just came on. It was on TBS, because TBS plays it every single week.
Right.
And which is one of my favorite movies. But if you remember how Jerry Maguire starts, Tom Cruise wakes up in the middle of the night, or this is in the beginning, he wakes up in the middle of the night, he has his epiphany, he goes to the typewriter, and he starts just kind of writing.
Right.
And he ends up with this manifesto, and in the middle of the night, he goes and he gets copies, and then he goes to his office and he distributes them in all the copies of his coworkers, and that was the beginning of the thing. And Seth's major feedback to me was that I didn't have a voice in my work. My writing lacked a voice. It wasn't kind of original. It didn't really have a clear direction. And when I was watching Jerry Maguire, I realized, well, what if I just tried, instead of using my own voice, to use Jerry Maguire's voice, right? So what I did, I actually Googled Jerry Maguire, the manuscript online, and it turns out that the very manuscript that you see in Jerry Maguire, which you never actually know what was in it.
Right.
Cameron Crowe, who actually wrote the movie, actually wrote out the entire manifesto. It's like a 10,000 word document that's online. You can read it, because he wanted Tom Cruise to know kind of what was in that manifesto, even though it was never published, right? And so I read it, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. I mean, it was like the right tone. It was exactly kind of the type of work that I wanted to do. So
right.
I used it as inspiration. I started waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, really early, and I would imagine myself as Jerry Maguire at the typewriter, and I would just kind of write. And it's a true story. after like a week and a half of doing that, I was like, you know what? I actually have something that's pretty good here. And so I sent it off, and Seth really liked it, and that kind of became the totality of the book. So I guess to answer the question, how did I do it? I think there's a couple lessons. One is obviously not to give up, but two is sometimes kind of pretending to be somebody else, or to kind of, people say like, fake it till you make it. I think there's some truth to that. I think really going outside of yourself and trying to do what you think you can be effective.
So then that being said, digging back into that same topic in terms of overcoming your fear to start a business, I mean, that's kind of its own monster too. And I would surmise that it would be as difficult, if not a greater difficulty, in just different aspects or different areas.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, starting business is incredibly scary, and it's I have a startup right now, and things are going well, but there's always ups and downs, and so it's not for the weak at heart, for sure, entrepreneurship. But I think that the key is being so invested in something that it's worth it, and I'm really invested in this idea of helping organizations, because I think that organizations have this incredible power to change the world, and I want to do my job, which is enable organizations to be able to fulfill their missions, and I'm really committed to that. So that kind of gets me through some of those ups and downs. But
right.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough being an entrepreneur, but I think so many people are unhappy with what they're currently doing, whether they be at a corporation, organization, or whatever maybe they're in school or something. And they're afraid of switching to like starting your own business. But I think you need to be more afraid of just staying where you are. And right. That's what I was. I didn't like it. At one point in Ernst Young, I really was not happy. And I was more afraid that I would die at that company right. than I would, the fear of being an entrepreneur. And I think once you start to play that trick on yourself, once you start to focus on the fear of being where you are instead of where you're afraid to go, you start to light a fire.
Totally agree. Did you jump all in, would you say, when it came to this transition?
Sort of. I did try that a couple times, where I jumped all in and I kind of developed a theory. There are two types of people, especially entrepreneurs. There's one type is the one that should just cut themselves off from whatever they're currently doing and just go all in, right? Because
right.
the pain, like the fear of like not being able to pay your rent, or being homeless, for example,
right.
will drive you towards success. But then there's the other type of category, the type of person, I think, that they don't really do well that way, because when they go all in and they cut themselves off from, like, for example, their financial support, they become so, unresourceful, and they become so they start to freak out, and they lack certainty so much that they're not able to be effective.
Right.
I thought I was in the first category, and I tried it a couple times, and I realized I wasn't. I was in the second category. And so I did a transition where I kind of was doing some freelance work for a while, and kind of, I had a part-time job for a while doing some things just to really have the type of financial support while I was, for example, doing some of the entrepreneurial things that were my dreams. So I think, everybody needs to identify which one they are and kind of pick the path that's right for them. But yeah, mine is the second, I think.
Totally agree. Sometimes you just got to test them out too, huh? Right.
I agree.
What piece of advice would you give to an aspiring writer or an aspiring entrepreneur? Somebody just starting out or just starting to get their feet wet in either endeavor?
Well, let me talk to the writer, because I'm very interested in writing right now. And I just think that it sounds so simple, but the most important thing you have to do is you got to write. And you've got to turn pro, as Stephen Pressfield will tell you, and exactly. I know you're a big fan of Stephen Pressfield, but, this idea that if you're a writer, then your job is to write, and every single day you have to write a certain number of words. And sure, you'll fall off sometimes, but you have to be concerned with quantity over quality, especially in the beginning. And, if there's a hump that you'll get over if you turn pro for long enough, where writing becomes a lot easier, just like talking becomes easier at a very early stage in our life. And until you get over that hump, you're going to be really frustrated. So become a pro as soon as you can. Turn pro and write as much as you can until you start you start getting good at it. And the one last thing I'll say about that was a great insight from his name is escaping me right now. The guy from NPR who Ira Glass. Right. Ira Glass had this great interview that's on YouTube that I thought was a brilliant insight, which is that when you're in any type of creative field, what you realize is that the reason why you're in that creative field is because you really like what you're doing. You really like for example, it's writing, you really like writing. And you're really good at knowing what good writing is, right? Or else you wouldn't like it. I mean, you're kind of sort of good writing. But the problem is when you first start to write, your taste, what you're doing, your work product doesn't match the level of your taste. You get really frustrated because your work sucks, but you have really great taste in writing. It's just not your own. So you have to get past, you got to keep doing and dealing with your bad stuff until the quality of your work matches kind of your own personal taste.
I love that. I had actually never heard of that, but I'm definitely going to take some notes on that and kind of reflect on that for a while. I think that's something I could use myself, just being super critical of my own work. That's awesome. I love that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, the one thing that I often think about is that I've been very lucky in some of the things that have happened over the last couple of years. I mean, getting my book published, for example, by the Domino Project, which is incredible, and it was a major milestone for me. And I'll be the first person to admit the luck of that. The one thing that I do constantly think about is the fact that when I happened to be in the presence of Seth, when he was starting the Domino Project, I had already been working on that book, and I already had a proposal before I even knew that the Domino Project existed. Right. And and I think to myself, wow, had I never decided to actually write a book, then I would have never been where I needed to be in order for that to have worked. You know what I mean? Like if I had come up to Seth and said, hey, by the way, I really want to write a book, for example, I'd love for you to consider, me. He would have just looked away, right? Because the universe just doesn't reward this kind of wish-washiness, right? I think what was really valuable, and again, I think about this a lot, is the fact that I had decided to write a book. Not only did I decide I wanted to write a book, I already knew what book I wanted to write, or at least the idea for it. And that's critical because when you walk around the world, there's so many people that are willing to help people who have already decided, but most people will turn a blind eye to people who are still kind of on the fence. So the most important piece of advice I could give anybody that's listening is decide, make a decision as to what direction you want to go in, because as soon as you do and you commit to it, the entire world will kind of organize in a way that'll help you. That doesn't guarantee success, but it makes it a lot more likely.
That is excellent. Thank you so much, Al, for being on the show today and talking a little bit with us and taking a ton of notes. And I'm going to write them up, and they should be in the show notes online at my website, tommorkes.com. Check out the website, and then check out Al's stuff. Check out his book, too. Read this before our next meeting. You can find it on Amazon. And check out his website. Again, that's modernmeetingstandard.com. And you can subscribe to his blog. It's really, really good. And I think everybody should check it out. So thank you, Al, for talking today, and yeah, man, just good luck with everything.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, Tom. I mean, I read your blog. I love it. I'm a big fan. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Al. All right, man. I'll catch up with you later. And that wraps up In the Trenches, Broadcast 3 with Al Pittampalli. To find the show notes, just go to www.tommorkes.com/broadcast3. That's the number 3. I hope you enjoyed this broadcast of In the Trenches as much as I did. And until next time, this is Tom Morkes. If you're listening to this, you are the resistance.
Thank you for listening to In the Trenches. Your creative work doesn't stop here. Join the Resistance, the small but growing army of entrepreneurs and artists putting a dent in the world at www.tommorkes.com. Never fight alone. Join the Resistance.